Hello and welcome to another tutorial. My name is Brandon Hicks with Blender Unleashed, and I want to welcome you to Essential Modeling Skills Part 2. So if you haven't watched Part 1 yet, then head over to my channel Blender Unleashed and watch Part 1. In this tutorial, we're going to be covering some more of the edit mode operators that will allow you to modify an object. So let's get into that, and I'm going to show you how to get up to speed quickly on what you need to know in order to model in Blender. So one more time, I'm going to remind you that the keyboard shortcuts as I use them are going to be displayed in the upper right hand corner over here. And so as I jump around my scene, you can see that those are popping up. And so those are there for your reference as you need them. So first I want to cover a few things in object mode that we didn't cover last time. And then I'm going to jump into edit mode and show you some operators. So the first thing I want to mention, if I didn't mention this last time, is that you can switch in and out of wireframe view and shaded view by just hitting Z on your keyboard. And this works in object mode or edit mode. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Z on the keyboard will switch this on and off. So that's handy if you need to be able to quickly look through a mesh and see the back side of it. So one more thing I want to talk about is how to duplicate an object before we get into actually editing the pieces of an object itself. So if you're in object mode, let's say I switch into top view here, and I want to make a copy of this object. Well, there are two different duplication methods. One is regular duplication, and that's going to make a copy of an object and just place it somewhere else in the 3D viewport. Now, these are not connected in any way. And if I were to delete that, I can show you the other duplication method, which is duplicate linked. So if I hit Alt D or Option D on the Mac, now I can make a duplication. And the difference is this one is linked. So whatever I do to this one will be done to the other one, but only in edit mode. So you can see in object mode, I scaled this one down and nothing happened to this. But if I tab into edit mode, you're now going to be able to see both of these objects in edit mode. And so what I do to one will happen to the other. So you can see just by making selections around the object, it's selecting the corresponding face on the other object that I duplicated. Now remember, this is only with duplicate linked. So I can edit the original object, but I can't really edit the linked object. So let's say I selected all of the faces on this original object. If I were then to scale up or down, it's going to remember the position and do the corresponding amount of scaling on the other object. But it's going to remember what I did in object mode and kind of add those together. So I can scale this down, but it's going to be on top of whatever I did in object mode. So if I make this really small, once again, it's just going to mirror whatever happens. And so this is because this is linked. Now, if this isn't linked, let's say I reset the scale there, so we're back to normal. If I were to use Shift D to duplicate this, then you're going to notice these are two separate objects completely. So if I tab into edit mode here, you are not going to see anything about this other object in the scene because Blender doesn't think that they are related. And so I can make all the edits I want to this object, and it's not going to matter at all because they're two separate copies. So that is how duplication works. You have a linked method and you have an unlinked method, which is basically just copying something, and they have no connection whatsoever. So one more thing I want to talk about in object mode that will allow you to kind of move between object and edit mode with a mesh is how to combine and separate objects. So using the cube as an example right here, let's say I duplicated a bunch of these using the regular duplication, not the linked duplication. And so I've got a bunch of copies laying around. These are all separate objects, as you can see here. And so what if I want to take all these objects and combine them into one single object as far as Blender is concerned in object mode? Well, what I can do is I can right click and then hold shift and right click the rest of these till they're all selected. Whatever the last one I select is will be a brighter orange outline than the other objects. This tells me that this is the actively selected object. So that's going to be important in a minute. So let's say I right click on the middle object one more time to make sure it's the last one that's selected. Now what I can do is I can go through the menus down onto the object menu, and then I can combine here, or I can just use Control J as far as my keyboard shortcuts go, and that is going to allow me to combine in the 3D viewport. So now you're going to notice that if I tab into edit mode, I see all of the geometry for every single object that I just combined, because now Blender thinks these are all a single object. So it doesn't matter that they aren't connected in 3D space. The fact that they're not actually touching and there's gaps in here, it doesn't make any difference. As far as Blender is concerned, we've told it that it needs to treat all of these as a single object. And so it's just basically how you group things. You can group things as objects or separate things back out. Now, one thing to be aware of is your actively selected object is what is going to be combined as far as the rest of these objects combined into. So let me explain what that means. So if I were to undo this to where we have separate objects again, once again, you'll notice that whatever I select is my active selection. When I start selecting more than one thing, everything that's not active is a darker orange. Everything that is active is a bright orange. And you really only have one active object at a time. So basically, think of it this way. Whatever I click last is the focus of the combine operation, or any operation in Blender. The actively selected object is going to be used for that. So if I select over here as my last object, and it's my active object, when I do the combine operation, it's going to think that I'm combining all the rest of these objects into this object. And so the reason this is important is because if I were to rotate this in object mode, you can see now the pivot for all of these objects is now the last object I selected, because that is sort of the main location of the object in object mode, because it was my active selection. So that's just important to keep in mind. You also need to remember to have an active selection. Let's say I box select these instead. And let's say I have everything deselected and I don't have an active selection. If I try to combine these, sometimes it works. I have an active selection. Sometimes it won't. So if I don't have something actively selected, let's say I add, let's say another piece of geometry or something over here. That's my actively selected object right now. If I were to grab all of these boxes, select the monkey head, and then let's say deselect it, now you'll notice I don't have an actively selected object because I didn't click anything other than the monkey for my last object. So all of these are dark orange, and when I try to combine using Control J, it's going to tell me active object is not a selected mesh. So nothing is the focus of the operation, and it doesn't know how to prioritize how to combine all these together. So I need to make sure I have an active object. So I can select the monkey, then try to do the same thing, and now it goes, all right, I know where the focus is. It's the monkey head. So now these are all one object. And once again, the monkey was my active object, so that's where the origin is going to go. So let's go ahead and undo that. I'm going to get rid of this. Now, once we have several objects that are combined, it might be important to get in here and separate these back out. Let's say we decide later, well, we don't want this particular model to be a part of this object. Well, once we have a selection, if we want to separate this back out, all we have to do is hit P on the keyboard. That will bring up the separate menu. And you can separate by the selection, you can separate by the material of the current selection, or you can separate by loose parts. And so basically what I want to do here is, let's just say I hit P. If I hit loose parts, that's going to separate everything that isn't actually connected with geometry. And so now these are all separate objects again. But let's say I recombine these and I have this selected. Nothing is selected on these other two cubes over here. If I hit P and then choose selection, it's only going to separate this one out. So now these are still one object. And this is its own object because we separated it out as the selection. Now, an interesting thing is you'll notice that these two cubes, because they were originally part of this cube, and that was the active selection when we grouped them, the pivot point is still over there. You can see the orange dot moves around, but it's remembering that it was originally where this cube is. So if I were to rotate, it's still going to rotate around that pivot point. So to fix this, what you can do is come over to the tools palette, go down to set origin, and you can choose how to move your pivot point around by going to the geometry origin, You can move the geometry to the origin where it exists already. You can put your 3D cursor somewhere and it will move your origin to that. Or you can put your origin to the center of mass, which can help if you're trying to do something like a physics simulation or something like that. And you get a little bit more advanced in Blender working on animation. So what I usually do is use the origin to geometry. That's going to average between these two objects and put it somewhere in the middle. So do that. And now you can see it's averaging that pivot point between both objects that are part of the active object. Once again, this is already fixed in the middle, so we don't have to correct that pivot point. And now you know a little bit about how to combine and separate objects in Blender. That's going to help you move on into edit mode, where you can actually start tweaking these models. And if you ever need to kind of separate your meshes back out, now you know how to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of everything we don't need in the 3D viewport. So we just are back to one cube. So let's say I want to select all of this and I can separate it. Tab back into object mode, right click that, delete that. Now I'm just back to one cube. Now, once again, the pivot point is not where we want it. It's way off in the middle because that's how we moved it around. So let's go ahead and use our set origin to geometry. That's going to relocate that around the center of our world because our cube is exactly centered. So this is actually a little off. So let's zero these back out. And then once again, set origin to geometry. Okay, so now we are back to a perfect cube in the middle of our world. It's still subdivided up. So now we can use that to jump into the rest of our operators. So let me recenter the view here. Now, getting in here, I want to talk a little bit about how you can access menus quickly in edit mode to access all of the commands we're going to be covering. Once again, you can go through multiple menus to get to where you need to be. The mesh menu is where you're going to find all these under faces, edges, and vertices, but you'll notice each one of these has a corresponding keyboard shortcut to bring these up in the 3D viewport. So let's go over these. They're really simple to remember. If you're in edit mode, basically use the first letter of whatever component it is you're trying to manipulate. So right now we're in face mode. So if I hit Control F, I will bring up the faces menu. And these are all of the edit operations I can do on faces inside Blender. So those are all grouped in one menu for you. Now, even though I'm in face mode, if I hit Control E, that's going to bring up the edges menu. And that's all of the operations that Blender can do to edges. And then like you would expect, Control V is going to be the vertices menu. And these are all the operations that can be done to a single vertex or a group of vertices. So now that you know how to open those, I don't use those a lot unless there isn't a keyboard shortcut for whatever I'm doing, because I don't really like having to dig through the menus. So some of these things, you'll notice if I hit Control F, will have keyboard shortcuts out to the right. Those are the ones you want to memorize because those are built in that way. The rest of these are operations that are still maybe important, things that you want to know, but they don't necessarily have a keyboard shortcut default assigned to them. And so you might have to open this menu to use this command. You can also use the spacebar and the dynamic spacebar menu or the search right here to dig through that. I talked about that in the part 1, so I won't cover that again, but that's basically how you can start getting in here and playing with these operators. So now that I've gone over the menus, let's talk about how to do some creative operators in terms of adding geometry back to an object. So let's say I got in here and I deleted 2 or 3 of these faces, right? So we got some holes in our mesh, and let's say I've decided, you know what, I want those back, but I've already done some editing and, you know, I can't just undo this. So what I'm gonna have to figure out is how to fix this. Well, what I can do is I have a lot of options for how to kind of get my geometry back. If you want to create a face, all you need to do is make sure you have the boundary of where that face needs to be selected. So in this case, I'm in vertex mode and I'm selecting all of the vertices that would make up a face. And if I just hit F on the keyboard, that's going to make a face. You can also do this in edge mode by selecting the edges. But basically the idea is if I select where the face needs to go by selecting the points that make up the face, and then I hit F on the keyboard, it's going to create the face for me. So this will save you some time pretty quickly if you want to get in here and just recreate the faces. Once again, I've got a face that needs to go here. I can hit F. That's going to create a face. Now, when I have a situation where there's a bunch of faces that need to be made, you can come in here and select all of the surrounding geometry again, and then hit F. That's going to do a fill and create a face, but it's going to create an n-gon. And an n-gon is basically a polygon that has more than 4 sides, and it's generally not a good idea if you're going to get into doing any kind of subdivision surface modeling or any kind of modifiers that are going to need to have quads or triangles. You pretty much want to keep everything in quads as a general rule when you're modeling. And so you can start by creating an n-gon. Just remember, you're going to have to come back and figure out a way to create another edge here and fix the fact that this is one giant face because it has more than 4 sides. So if I were to switch into edge mode, you can see that I've got 3 edges here, but then I've got 4, 5, 6 edges. And technically speaking, that means that, this is not a square, not a quad. And the reason that's the case is because if I were to modify this so that it wasn't just laid out like a rectangle, then you can see that it's going to change shape. And now this is a better representation of maybe how many sides we have on the shape. And it's not 4 sides, it's 6. And so we would need to figure out a way to split this up to where we're back to 4 sides to kind of keep everything clean up. So we're going to learn how to do that in this tutorial. But now that you know how to fill things, I'm going to show you how to do that using another command, which is actually called the fill operator. So let me undo this back to where we were. So what we just went over was the make face. This also works for edges. So let's just say I did want to select this vertice and this vertice. If I hit F, it's going to create an edge for me. That only works if you're using 2 vertices and not 3, because as soon as you select the third one, it's going to think you want to create a face, which is a triangle here. And so with just 2 vertices selected, you can actually create an edge. And so now that we have that selected, once again, we can select the surrounding edges and create our faces again to get back to where we were. Now, let's say I didn't do that and I had, once again, this big gaping hole with a lot of sides and, just kind of a mess. Let's say I even make this even more complicated by deleting this face. So now we have a kind of a weird shape and we want to fill all this back in really quickly. Well, we can use fill instead of the make face command. So if I were to select all these edges right here, if I hit Control F on the keyboard to bring up my faces menu, then you'll see that the keyboard shortcut for fill is Alt F. And so that will automatically fill that in for me. Now by default, it's going to do triangles instead of quads because it's just easier to figure out how to fill that hole back up. And then if you want to combine 2 of these back into a quad, what you can do is just select those in face mode, hit F, and now it is a face. So this works to convert triangles into quads. But you'll see I can also do this for quads and n-gons. So it really is just up to you what you need to do. So that is how the fill and the make edge or face commands work. One more thing I want to show you now is something that's pretty exciting when you first learn it, which is the extrude operator. So to do an extrusion, basically you just have to have a selection like a bunch of faces. It will work on edges and vertices, but it does extrusions on a bit different. So I would recommend starting with faces because it's a little easier to understand what's going on. So now that I have a selection, let's say I want to kind of extrude these out. What I can do is hit E on the keyboard, and that's going to start extruding a region, which will allow me to duplicate the faces and then extrude those out as if this is a piece of clay or something. And it's going to keep these connected to the original mesh and create all new faces as it moves out from the middle. So this is a really quick way to add geometry onto an existing mesh. And it doesn't matter what your selection is, as long as you hit E to extrude, it will default to constraining you to an axis. And then if you come over here to the options, you'll see that you can constrain after the fact to either one of these axes. You can change the size and what kind of editing it's doing and all sorts of things. You'll notice too that here we've got extrude region or individual faces. And so by default, it extrudes all the faces you have selected together as a single object. But let's say I want to do a cluster like this, but I want to extrude each of these faces individually. I can click extrude individual. That'll bring these out. And then the interesting thing is here, these are actually not connected in the middle. So if I were to scale these out, let's say I'm scaling, if I can choose individual origins, that will scale by each of the faces by their center, and that will allow me to show that they are completely separate objects. Now, that's not the case for the rest of these because we extruded by region. So if I were to scale these down, you can see, or if I switch in a wireframe, you can see that in the middle, there's no geometry or edges connecting those as separate pieces. So over here, we do have geometry in the middle, and that's separating those out into separate faces. So you have options over here in terms of how you want to extrude an object. And typically, I only use the extrude region, which is the default if you hit E on the keyboard. And again, you can come over here and use these when you need them, but that's basically how extrude works, and it's extremely useful. Something I use a lot when I model, and one of the first things you should definitely keep in mind as you're learning. So the next thing I want to talk about is how to subdivide. Now, subdividing is getting into kind of multiplying the geometry that we have in front of us. So whereas extrude will take pieces of your mesh and it will create new geometry like this, with the divisional operators, you're going to kind of exponentially be increasing your polygon count based on your selection. So let me show you what subdivide does. If I were to select all of these faces right here, I can subdivide these, which would basically do exactly what it sounds like. It would split these up into smaller pieces. So to access subdivide, we're going to need a new menu, which is called the specials menu, which is W on your keyboard. And this will kind of bring up a menu that's full of operators that don't belong anywhere else. So they're not specific to faces, edges, or vertices, but they also don't really belong in any of those other categories necessarily. Now, the specials menu is going to have subdivide right at the top. Subdivide, if you click this, is going to automatically take your selection and cut it up evenly. And so let's do this with just one face to kind of show you what that looks like. Hit W and click subdivide. That's going to split it from one face into 4. So you can see it exponentially increases the geometry. And I can just continue to do this by changing the number of cuts from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And it will just continually subdivide this. Now, one thing to keep in mind as you do this is that because you're not subdividing the surrounding geometry, you are going to end up with problems because you don't have a termination point for these vertices on the rest of the geometry around. So what I mean by that is I have all of these individual vertices now, if I were to switch into vertex mode, that are located on this edge running down the side of all of these faces, but I don't have corresponding vertices on this face. So if I were to do something as with a modifier, such as smoothing this out, it's going to do some really weird things when it tries to multiply the smoothing and the geometry on this part of the mesh, because there's not a clean separation and a clean division of all those points on the surrounding geometry. So let me undo that. And so let's go ahead and extrude some of these again, and then let's subdivide those. So here we got the same issue. At top, we have a subdivided surface. We have a bunch of different edges. But down the side, we don't have any sort of exit strategy for these points. So what you end up doing is creating a 5-sided polygon right here. So we just talked about how important it is to stay with quads and not have n-gons. Well, you're creating an n-gon. So because of this one vertex in the middle, now this has 5 sides instead of 4 because of the 2 edges now at top. So just remember that when you do this, keep it in mind, you may have to fix things after the fact. And to do that, we can use the other commands that we're going to go over right now. So after you know how to subdivide things, that can be a quick way to add some geometry in, but you might need to make some additional changes. So how do I cut in specific edges, like say from here to here? Well, there are a lot of ways to do that. And one of the things you can do that is a very manual way of going about doing it is using the knife tool. So if I were to deselect everything and just hit K on my keyboard, you'll see that it changes the icon for my 3D cursor. And now it's giving me a green dot, and it's giving me these options as I hover over different parts of my mesh. What this is going to do is start a knifing operation, which if I basically pick an area, I can left click once, pull my mouse over to another point, let's say down here. If I left click there, I've completed a cut there. And to finish out the operator, I can just hit enter on my keyboard. And now that's going to finish the knife operation. So what that did is basically created an edge on this face that cuts through the mesh down to this point. And so now if we were to switch into face mode, you can see I've got two faces right here. So that solves one of the problems that we have, because this is now a quad, but we've also created a triangle. Now, triangles inherently by themselves aren't bad, but again, if you start to do things like smoothing an object, it can create some weird things that are happening in the corners and pinching and things like that. So, as a general rule, you don't want to start off by learning how to create triangles and mixing those with your quads. Just keep everything in quads, keep everything in squares, and you're going to have a much easier time. So that's how knifing works. Now let's do this again, and I'll just show you a little bit more about it. When you are hovering over a vertex, it's going to kind of snap into place. And so that's a good thing to kind of get everything lined up correctly. If you want to cut not to another vertice, but to the middle of an edge, you can also do that. So let's say I want to cut right on the middle right here. I can left click in the middle of this edge and then hit enter on the keyboard, and that's going to cut and create a new vertex right here. So switching into vertex mode, you can see I've now continued this edge down from here through the middle of this extrusion down to the top of our cube. And that solves this problem, but I would have to go all the way around my object with one continuous line to come back up to this point to solve really the whole problem so that we're all back to quads as far as this goes. So to do that, you could still use the knife operator. So let's try that. If I hit K, I can left click on the last vertex that I created. And then if I want to continue this, I can just basically left click and keep doing that all the way through my mesh. Now here, I don't want to have to left click every single time to go through down to this bottom edge. So I'll just move down to the bottom edge, and it's going to create new vertices for me automatically. I can rotate around on my 3D viewport, left click on the other side of the cube. That's going to, once again, cut all the way through those faces. Come back to the other side of the cube, left click once again. Now remember, we're still in knife operator, one single command. I haven't, done multiple cuts or anything like that. So you don't want to hit escape or anything else while you're doing this. Just remember that as long as you see this line, you're still inside the knife operator. So now to terminate this, if I jump back up and I left click on this vertex to finish my cut all the way around, which is a loop cut, by the way, then once again, I can just hit enter on the keyboard, and that will accept that cut. And now we have a continuous edge loop running all the way through our mesh. Now, this fixes this problem, but we would have to do this for all of our 5-sided n-gons all the way around to make sure that this works. So we could do that manually, but it would be a little bit of a waste of time because of some of the other operators. So I just wanted to show you that's how the knife operator works. If you're getting in here and you don't really know what you're doing as far as how to fix topology, or you're trying to just work on a mesh and work out a problem, manually doing it with a knife tool can be a real help because it allows you to kind of explore what's going on as you're doing it. So a few more tools to go over before we wrap this up. One thing I want to talk about is the Vertex Connect tool, which is a really quick way to connect and kind of cut through a mesh using one command. So let's say I want to just, again, connect here to here. I can right click to select both of those vertices. And I just want an edge connect in the middle, but I want it to be in cutting this face. I can just hit J on the keyboard, and that will allow me to cut through. And once again, you can see we have two faces here. Now you don't want to hit F on your keyboard. So let's see what happens when we do that. If we were to select these 2 points and hit F, it's going to look like it does the same thing. But if we were to go into face mode, you can see it's not. It's still a single face here. And so if I were to move this around, you can see that we have a edge that is kind of rogue out in 3D space. and it's not actually connected to anything. So it's not cutting the face down the middle. It looks like it is from a certain angle, but it's actually not connected. You can see actually all the way through the mesh, as you see right there, as I rotate. So I'm gonna undo that and get back to where we just have this. And so you want to use the J command. So that's going to cut through. Now it doesn't just have to be from one vertex to another. You can use the cut all the way through a mesh. So let's say I want to go down to here. Well, as long as I have two of these selected, it's going to try to find the shortest path all the way to these two vertices to join them. So if I hit J, you can see it's going to go down to here to connect right there as an average between these 2 points. And then it's going to connect down to the bottom. Now, once again, this is actually creating new geometry and splitting our mesh for us. So this could be a quick way to go through and create new geometry. So let's see what we can do as far as getting our edge loop going all the way back around to the other side. Now, if we were just to select here to here, the shortest path is all the way across. Well, we already have a bunch of edges there. So if I were to hit J, it's just going to show me that those are connected already. And you can see it's not creating any new geometry for us. But if I were to kind of give it a bit of a guide, by showing it with the knife tool, that I want to go down to, let's say here, to start the cut. And once I accept that, you can see that it's creating those cuts for me. Now here, it didn't go all the way through because I didn't actually grab the right part of this right here. Let me undo this. And I'm gonna have to make a cut here, down to here, and across so that it kind of knows where I want it to go. Now I can go through these faces and hit enter. So now we've kind of given it a starting direction. Now the shortest path to this point and the point over here is going to be a little easier for Blender to figure out where we're going. So if we hit J, once again, it's going to try to go back this direction because we haven't gone far enough over. But if I continue this idea that I'm going around the mesh until I get to the other side, to at least here, let's hit enter to accept that. You can see that starting from our original location, going down through the mesh all the way over to here, now we have a short path from here up to here. And so this time when I hit J, it should work. It should automatically connect these back up to the side, and it does. So that can be handy if you want to quickly connect things that are relatively close to one another and you think Blender will be able to see the distance between them. Hit just connect the first and the last, hit J, and it will create the geometry in the middle for you. So that's Vertex Connect, and a couple more commands I want to cover really quickly because we're kind of running out of time here is the loop, cut, and slide, which is a very important command that I use quite a lot, and then also bevel. So loop, cut, and slide is going to kind of do what we just did, but do it all in one command. So it's going to create an edge loop going around part of our model, and it's going to allow us to position that once we create it somewhere just like this. So I can use this to really quickly block in my geometry where I need to, and then I just have to do a little bit of cleanup here and here to clean up those last two edges. So the way this works is basically, if I want a loop cut, it's going to allow me to hit Control R to start a loop cut. And this magenta sort of color is going to tell me where I can create my loop cuts. Now, the only way that Blender knows how to create or insert a loop cut is if it has a bunch of clean faces to go all the way through the middle of. So they need to be quads, and it needs to know how to create a path all the way through them. You'll see it won't work up here. It'll stop short because this is an n-gon. So if I try to create a loop cut, it's not going to let me do it there. And if I try to create it going around the object, it's going to stop short right in the middle because, once again, this is not a quad, it's an n-gon. So just remember, if you're in the middle of this and you need to rotate around, you can hit escape to cancel the operation and then kind of rotate around and pick where you want your cuts to be. So let's say, see if we have anything else left we need to add in. We've already kind of added in all the places that we need to. Quickly reconnect these just so we have some clean quads to deal with once more, so we don't have any more n-gons. And there we go. We fixed all of our n-gons. So now if we try to loop cut, it's going to allow us to loop cut through the middle of this. So if I were to want to loop cut using the magenta as a guide, I can left click to accept the cut. And now what it's going to do is immediately throw me into edge slide mode, to where it will allow me to pick where I want to insert that on the surface of the mesh. Now, if I want to just leave it where it was in the very exact middle, I can right click to cancel the slide operation, but it will keep the cut operation. So one more time, if I hit Control R to start the cut, left click to accept that, and then if I come down here and I go, no, I want it right in the middle, I can right click to cancel, and it will average the distance between here and keep those right in the middle for me. So that's how loop cutting works. You can also start a cut, come down here and decide I want it right there, left click to accept that, and then you're good to go. That's the basic idea behind loop cutting. You'll notice if you look in the lower left-hand corner of your 3D viewport in the middle of an operation, you're going to have some information down here that shows you that there are options available to you to change the behavior of the operator. So let's say I start cutting right here. You'll notice in the lower left-hand corner now, it says select a ring to be cut, use mouse wheel or page up and down for number of cuts, hold Alt for smooth. So if I were to left click right here to select this, I'm now on the edge slide operator, and it's changed this information to show me specifically where on the model that's sliding by number. And then it says E even off, Alt or C clamp on. And that's going to tell me if I hit C for clamp, I can turn that on and off, and that's going to clamp the operation. F for flipped, on and off. And so all of these are going to give you new operations and new options for your operators that you might not have had before. And so it's important to remember that the lower left-hand corner is going to give you new information as you are doing an operating procedure. And also, as soon as you are done with an operator, if you're to look down the lower left-hand corner of your tools palette, you're going to see that it has some memory involved in terms of your decision that you made. So when I first loop cut, I decided I wanted to cut right here, and it's going to be left in the middle. Now, if I want to change any of those options, I can come back over here before I do my next operator and kind of change the way this works. So I have all of these that will tweak what I just did. I can change the number of cuts from 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5. I can do this live if I want by, let's say, starting a new cut over here. And if I want to change the number of cuts as I start to cut, I can just scroll up with my mouse wheel, my middle mouse wheel, and that will allow me to change the number of cuts dynamically as I'm in the 3D viewport. So if I want to cut this twice, just scroll up once until I've got 2 cuts, and now I can right click to cancel the slide, and it's going to subdivide that right down the middle. Now, once again, as long as I don't do anything like deselecting this, coming over and moving something around, so where I've initiated another operator, it will remember that. So I can change this to 3 or 4 cuts after the fact if I really need to. And this is going to allow me to do some interesting things like smoothing this operation out. So you can do all sorts of things if you will just get into the options for how the operators work. So that's just important to remember. And the last thing I want to kind of go over is something that's called the bevel command. So I know we're kind of getting into a long tutorial here, and I apologize for that, but I really wanted to wrap this up by showing you the bevel command because it's used so much in hard surface modeling, and it's something I think you should familiarize yourself really quickly when you get into Blender. So the way the bevel command works is that basically if you have a number of edges selected, let's say I have a bunch of edges all the way around this top part of the cube selected, bevel is going to allow me to kind of increase the number of edges on this corner, but it's also going to smooth that out at the same time. So let me show you what that does. Control B is the shortcut for bevel. And as I do this operator, it's going to, as you'll see, bevel this by dividing those edges into 2 edges. And then as I move my mouse around, it's going to kind of move those edges around to where I have sort of a chamfered corner. And so if I were to scroll up on my mouse wheel, just like we learned with the loop cuts a second ago, it will increase the number of bevel cuts and kind of round off this edge for me. So this is a really quick way to get in here and add some new geometry. It's clean geometry. These are all still quads. You're not really destructively editing the mesh. And it's a really quick way to add some nice rounded off corners that just seem a little more realistic. The default cube is known for being too perfect right out of the box, and so you're going to need to do some tweaks such as beveling to make sure that that fixes that. Now, once again, if I don't select all the way around the mesh and I just were to select these edges isolated on one side, I can bevel, but it's going to maybe do some things that are not in my best interest. So let's say I were to turn the cuts up to 2 or 3 here. Now I've got a nice clean rounded off corner there, but I've also created a bunch of n-gons here because I didn't select that edge going all the way around the whole cube. So it was a loop. So once again, I'm gonna have to figure out how to fix this problem if I wanna get in here and use a subdivision surface modifier or any other kind of smoothing that isn't manual smoothing. So again, it's just my opinion, but if you're just starting to learn, I would really recommend getting into the habit of modeling in all quads. You can, as you go, model however you want, and then just remember you're gonna have to come back and kind of fix this n-gon problem. So that is the part 2 complete of the operators I think you need to know when you first get into modeling in Blender. If you really learn these operators and you keep them in your back pocket, you can do a lot without having to get into some seriously advanced sides of modeling in Blender, just doing it by hand. And it's really gonna allow you to separate yourself out as a modeler who knows what you're doing, because all of this is gonna be important when you get into doing more advanced things with your meshes. So learning how to extrude and do basic things like that, and then bevel is going to really quickly allow you to block out things. And then once you block out something and you're really confident with that, you can start stepping up your game and really taking some time to get in here and detail things and make things look really good just by practicing. So that would be my recommendation. Practice hard, practice often, and you're going to see results come pretty quickly. So that's going to wrap it for part 2. I want to thank you for stopping by and checking this out. I know it went a little long, but I think if you take these lessons to heart, it's really going to help you out when you get into modeling. So thank you. I'll see you in the next tutorial, and have a great day.